The first thing I saw was the red bow still taped to the hood of a brand new Mercedes parked in my parents' driveway, the kind of glossy black that reflects everything like a mirror, including me standing there holding a folder with my name on it, my inheritance paperwork, the same money that car was just paid with, and for a second I actually thought there had to be some kind of mistake because people don't just take something that belongs to you and turn it into a gift for someone else, not like this, not so openly, not with a smile. But then my sister Megan stepped out of the front door, keys dangling from her fingers, laughing as she hit the unlock button and the headlights flashed like the car was celebrating her. And that's when something inside my chest went very, very quiet, not anger, not even shock, just a kind of stillness that comes right before you understand everything. And I remember walking up the driveway slowly, gravel crunching under my sneakers, my dad standing by the garage with a glass of iced tea like this was just another normal afternoon. And I held up the folder, my hand steady even though my heart wasn't, and I said, "That's my money." And he didn't even look surprised, didn't even hesitate, he just took a sip and said, "Not anymore." Like he was correcting a small detail, like I'd gotten the weather wrong, and my mom, standing behind him with her arms crossed, gave me that look I'd known my entire life. The one that said I was being difficult. Again, that I was overreacting, that somehow I was the problem in a situation I didn't create, and Megan just leaned against the car, smiling, running her hand along the door like she'd earned it, like she deserved it. And maybe the worst part wasn't even what they did, it was how normal they made it seem, how easy it was for them to rewrite reality right in front of me. And I wish I could tell you I fought back right then, that I said something sharp or dramatic or powerful, but I didn't. I just stood there, staring at that car, at the reflection of myself in the paint, smaller somehow, like I'd been edited out of my own life. And what they didn't know, what none of them knew as they stood there celebrating, was that 2 weeks earlier, in a quiet room that smelled like lavender and hospital sheets, my grandmother had taken my hand and told me exactly where that money was supposed to go. And why, and I didn't realize then how important that conversation would become, or how one final phone call would change everything they thought they'd gotten away with. 2 weeks earlier, the air in my grandmother Eleanor's hospice room was warm and smelled faintly of lavender oil, the kind she insisted on bringing from home because she said hospitals tried too hard to erase people and replace them with machines. And I remember sitting beside her bed, my hand wrapped in hers, feeling how light her fingers had become compared to the woman who used to hold mine so firmly when I was a kid, guiding me across busy streets or steadying me when I fell. And she looked at me with that same clarity she had always had, sharp and unshaken even now, and said my name slowly, "Emily," like she needed to make sure I was really listening, not just hearing her but understanding her. And I leaned closer, thinking she was about to talk about her medications or the nurse or something small, but instead she asked, "Have they told you anything about the account?" And I shook my head, confused, because my parents had not told me anything about any account, not then, not ever. And she gave a small sigh, not angry, just disappointed in a way that felt heavier than anger, and she tightened her grip on my hand just enough to make me focus. "The savings, Emily, the one I set aside for you." And for a moment I could not find the right words because no one in my family had ever used a sentence like that about me. Not once, not in a way that mattered, and I said, "No, Grandma, I did not know." And she nodded like she expected that answer, like it confirmed something she had already suspected. And then she told me everything, how years ago she had quietly built that fund, how every birthday check, every small investment, every careful decision had been made with me in mind because she had seen what no one else in the house seemed willing to see. That I was always the one adjusting, the one stepping back, the one giving things up so everything stayed smooth for everyone else. And she said she wanted something in my life that was mine, completely mine, no conditions, no comparisons, no negotiations. And as she spoke, I felt something unfamiliar settle in my chest, something close to relief but also fragile, like if I moved too fast it might disappear. And I asked her why she had never told me before, and she smiled softly, the kind of smile that carried both kindness and caution. "Because timing matters," she said. "And because I needed to make sure it could not be taken from you." And those words stayed with me, even though I did not fully understand them at the time. And then she reached toward the small drawer beside her bed and pulled out a folded piece of paper, not official looking, not dramatic, just a simple document with a few lines and a signature, and she placed it in my hands and said, "This is not everything, but it is enough for you to know the truth." And I remember staring at my name printed there, clear and undeniable, connected to an amount of money that felt almost unreal, more than I had ever had access to in my entire life. And I felt this sudden, quiet hope rise up, the kind that does not shout or celebrate but simply exists, steady and patient, like maybe, just maybe, things could be different this time. Maybe I would not be the afterthought, maybe I would not be the one left out again. And I squeezed her hand and told her I understood, even though part of me was still trying to catch up, and she looked at me for a long moment as if memorizing my face, and then she said something I did not realize would matter as much as it did. If anything feels wrong, Emily, you come to me, do you understand? And I nodded without hesitation because at that moment, sitting in that quiet room with her, I believed that whatever she had planned would protect me, that for once the system I had grown up in, the one that always placed me last, would not be able to touch what was mine, and I did not realize then how quickly that belief would be tested or how completely it would be broken. I left the hospice that evening with the paper folded carefully inside my bag, not because it was fragile, but because it felt important in a way I had never experienced before, like I was carrying something that finally belonged to me and only me. And on the drive home I kept replaying her words in my head, the way she said timing matters, the way she looked at me when she said it could not be taken from you, and for the first time in years I let myself imagine a different version of my life. One where I did not have to calculate every decision around what my family thought I deserved. One where I could choose something for myself without asking for permission or bracing for disappointment. And I remember pulling into the driveway of my parents' house that night. The same house where every holiday, every dinner, every small moment had always seemed to orbit around Megan, and I sat in the car for a few extra seconds just breathing, steadying myself before going inside, telling myself that this time would be different, that I had something real now, something that could not be dismissed or minimized or quietly redirected to someone else. And when I walked in, the house was loud with conversation, my mom in the kitchen talking about guest lists for an upcoming event, my dad at the table scrolling through something on his phone, and Megan leaning against the counter laughing about a weekend trip she was planning, and for a moment I just stood there watching them, realizing how easy it would be to say nothing, to keep everything to myself the way I always had. But then I remembered my grandmother's voice, calm and certain, and I stepped forward and said, "Grandma told me about the account." And the room did not go silent the way I expected. There was no dramatic pause, no shock, just a subtle shift like a current changing direction beneath the surface. My dad looked up slowly, my mom stopped mid-sentence, and Megan's smile tightened just slightly before she turned away to grab a glass, and my father said, "What account?" in a tone that was almost casual, almost bored, like he was giving me a chance to reconsider what I was about to say, and I felt that familiar pressure, the one that always made me second-guess myself, but I pushed through it and said, "The one Grandma set aside for me." And this time my mother let out a small laugh, not amused but dismissive, the kind that reduces something before it can even fully exist. "Emily, your grandmother has always been sentimental," she said. "You know how she is." And Megan added, without even looking at me, "She probably just meant something small like a keepsake or jewelry." And I felt the paper in my bag like it was suddenly heavier, like it was the only thing anchoring me to what I knew was true, and I said, "It is not small." And that was when my father finally set his phone down and looked directly at me. His expression calm, controlled, the same expression he used whenever he was about to explain why I was wrong. "Emily," he said, "whatever your grandmother told you, we are handling her finances now, you do not need to worry about it." And there it was, that phrase. Again, "You do not need to worry about it," the same phrase they had used my entire life whenever something important was being decided without me. Whenever a door was being closed quietly in front of me while I was told it was for my own good. And I felt something shift inside me, not loud, not explosive, just a quiet refusal to step back this time, and I said, "I am not worried, I just want to understand." And for a second, just a second, I thought I saw something flicker across my father's face, something that looked almost like irritation, maybe even concern, but it disappeared just as quickly, replaced by that same steady composure. "There is nothing to understand," he said, and my mother nodded in agreement. "Everything is taken care of," she added, and Megan finally turned back toward me, her voice light, almost sympathetic. "You always think everything is about you, Emily," she said. And that was the moment I realized this was not going to be simple. This was not going to be acknowledged or clarified or resolved with a conversation, because whatever had already been set in motion in this house, it did not include me, and I did not realize then how far they had already gone or how close I was to finding out what taken care of really meant. The next morning I woke up earlier than usual, not because I had somewhere to be, but because something about the way my father had said everything is taken care of would not leave my mind. It sat there like a sentence that sounded complete but felt unfinished, and I kept thinking about the paper in my bag, about my grandmother's voice, about the way my mother had laughed as if the entire thing could be reduced to a misunderstanding, And I realized I needed something more than words. I needed proof that existed outside of their version of reality, so I made coffee, sat at the small kitchen table, and unfolded the document again, reading every line slowly this time, noticing details I had skimmed over before, the name of the account, the bank, the partial account number, and a date from just a few months ago that told me this was not some old forgotten arrangement. This was recent, intentional, active, and my stomach tightened as I reached for my phone and searched for the bank's number, hesitating for a moment before dialing because I could already hear my mother's voice in my head telling me I was overreacting, telling me I was making something out of nothing, but I pressed call anyway, and when the representative answered, her tone polite and professional, I explained that I was calling about an account connected to my grandmother Eleanor Carter, that I had documentation with my name on it, and I needed to confirm its status, and there was a pause, a brief clicking of keys, the soft rhythm of someone navigating through information that I could not see, and then she asked me to verify a few details, my name, my date of birth, the last 4 digits listed on the paper, and I answered everything carefully, my voice steady even though my hands were not, and then there was another pause, slightly longer this time, and when she spoke again, her tone had shifted just enough for me to notice. I am sorry, she said, but that account was closed, and for a second, I thought I had misheard her, like maybe the line had cut out or the words had blurred together, and I said, closed, and she confirmed it calmly, like it was the most normal thing in the world, like accounts closed every day and there was nothing unusual about it, and I forced myself to keep going, to ask the question I already knew the answer to but needed to hear anyway. When? And she told me the date, and it lined up exactly with the timeline of everything my grandmother had told me, just days after that conversation in the hospice room. And I felt something drop inside me, not suddenly, not dramatically, just a quiet, heavy realization settling into place. And I asked one more question, the one that mattered most: where did the funds go? And there was another pause, longer this time, and she explained that she could not disclose full details without authorization, but she could confirm that the funds had been transferred to another account under authorized family management, and those 3 words, authorized family management, echoed in my head long after the call ended. Because I knew exactly what they meant, I knew exactly who that pointed to. And I sat there in silence for a long moment, staring at the paper in front of me that now felt less like proof and more like a record of something that had already been taken. And then I looked out the window toward the driveway, toward the empty space where that car would soon be parked, and everything my father had said, everything my mother had dismissed, everything Megan had brushed aside suddenly aligned into one clear, undeniable truth. They had not misunderstood, they had not been confused, they had known exactly what that money was and who it belonged to, and they had taken it anyway. And the worst part was not even the loss, it was the realization that this had been decided without me long before I ever stepped into that room and spoke up, that by the time I said the words, the one she set aside for me, the outcome had already been sealed, and I did not realize then how far they were willing to go to keep it that way, or what it would cost them once the truth reached the one person they could not control. I did not go back inside right away. I just sat there at the kitchen table with my phone still in my hand, staring at the reflection of the screen after the call ended, replaying the words authorized family management over and over, like if I listened closely enough they might change, but they did not. They only became clearer, sharper, more final, and I realized something I had never allowed myself to fully admit before. This was not a misunderstanding that could be fixed with a conversation. This was a decision, deliberate and complete. And for the first time I started connecting it to everything else that had come before, all the small moments I had dismissed as coincidence or oversight, like the year Megan got a brand new laptop for college while I was told to make do with a refurbished one that froze every 30 minutes, or the time my parents paid for her spring break trip to Miami because she needed the networking opportunity, while I stayed home working extra shifts, or every holiday where her gifts were opened first, her stories listened to longer, her achievements celebrated louder, and mine were acknowledged with a quick nod. Before the conversation moved on, and I used to tell myself those things did not matter, that I was being sensitive, that families just had different dynamics, but sitting there with that document in front of me and that empty account confirmed in my ears, I could see the pattern clearly for what it was, not random, not accidental, but consistent, structured, predictable, and suddenly the car in the driveway was not just about money, it was the latest version of something that had been happening my entire life, just bigger, more visible, impossible to ignore, and I felt this tightness in my chest, not just from what they had taken, but from the realization of how long I had been adjusting myself to fit into a system that was never designed for me to win, and I thought about calling them right then, confronting them with what I had just learned, demanding an explanation that actually matched the facts. But I already knew how that would go. I could hear the responses before I even dialed, "You are misunderstanding. It is more complicated than that. You are being dramatic. We will explain later." The same phrases, the same tone, the same quiet dismissal dressed up as patience. And for a moment I almost convinced myself to wait, to give them time to handle it, the way they always said they would, to believe that maybe there was still some version of this where things would be made right without me having to push. But then I remembered my grandmother's voice again, not soft this time but firm. "If anything feels wrong, Emily, you come to me." And I looked back down at the paper, at my name printed there, at the evidence that what she had intended was real even if it had already been taken. And something inside me shifted again, not loudly, not dramatically, just a quiet line being drawn where there had never been one before, and I realized that waiting was exactly what they were counting on. That silence was the system that kept everything in place. And if I stayed quiet now, this would become just another thing I absorbed, another moment that would fade into the background of everything I did not challenge, and I could not do that this time, not after what she had told me, not after what I had just confirmed. And I stood up slowly, folding the document back into my bag, my movements calm even though my thoughts were not, and I grabbed my keys, already knowing where I needed to go. Because there was only one person in this entire situation who had not rewritten the truth to suit themselves, only one person who had said clearly and directly what that money was meant for. And as I walked toward the door, I realized something else, something I had not fully understood until that moment. This was not just about telling her what they had done. This was about what she would do once she knew. And I did not realize then just how prepared she already was, or how quickly everything would begin to unravel the moment I stepped back into that room. I did not remember the drive to the hospice in detail, only flashes, the red light I almost missed, the sound of my own breathing louder than the radio, the way my hands stayed tight on the steering wheel like if I loosened my grip everything might fall apart. And by the time I pulled into the parking lot, the late afternoon sun was already dipping low, casting long shadows across the building that made everything feel quieter, heavier, like the world was slowing down just enough for something important to happen. And as I walked through the automatic doors, past the reception desk and down the familiar hallway, I noticed the same details I had seen before, the soft hum of machines, the muted voices of nurses, the faint scent of antiseptic mixed with something warmer, something human, and it struck me how different this place felt compared to my parents' house, where everything was polished and controlled and carefully presented, because here nothing was hidden, everything was real. And when I reached my grandmother's room, I paused for just a second outside the door, my hand hovering over the handle, because I knew that once I walked in and said the words out loud, there would be no going back to pretending this was a misunderstanding. And I pushed the door open anyway, stepping inside quietly, and she was there exactly as I had left her, propped slightly against the pillows, a thin blanket pulled up to her chest, her eyes closed but not asleep. And when she heard the door, she opened them slowly and looked at me, really looked at me, the way she always did, like she could see past whatever I was trying to hide. And I moved closer, setting my bag down beside the chair. And for a moment I did not say anything, I just took her hand again, feeling the same lightness, the same fragile strength, and she studied my face carefully before speaking. "Something is wrong," she said, not as a question but as a quiet certainty. And I felt my throat tighten because she already knew, not the details but the truth underneath them, and I nodded, taking a breath that felt heavier than it should have. "The account," I said, my voice steady but softer than I expected. "It is gone." And there was a brief silence, not confusion, not disbelief, just a stillness that settled between us like a pause before a decision. And I watched her expression change, not dramatically, not with anger or shock, but with something sharper, something focused, and she asked one question, clear and direct. "What do you mean gone?" And I told her everything, the phone call, the closed account, the transfer, the words authorized family management, each detail laid out exactly as I had heard it. And I expected her to interrupt me, to react, to ask more questions, but she did not. She just listened, her eyes steady on mine the entire time, and when I finished, the room felt different, quieter somehow, like something had shifted in the air itself. And she did not speak right away, she just held my hand a little tighter, and then she let out a slow breath, not tired, not defeated, but measured, like she was organizing something in her mind. And when she finally spoke, her voice was calm, but there was something underneath it I had never heard before. Something firm, almost precise. "I was hoping I was wrong," she said, and that sentence landed harder than anything else because it meant this had crossed her mind already, that she had considered the possibility that what she set up for me might be taken, and she had prepared for it, and she turned her head slightly toward the small table beside her bed where her phone rested, and for a moment her gaze lingered there, thoughtful, deliberate, and then she looked back at me and said something that made my pulse quicken. Emily, there are some people who only understand things when they are written in a way they cannot ignore. And she released my hand just long enough to reach for the phone, her movements slow but certain, and as she unlocked it and scrolled through her contacts, I realized this was not a reaction, this was a step, something she had already planned for if this moment ever came, and I did not realize then exactly who she was about to call, or what that call would set in motion, but I knew one thing. With absolute clarity as I watched her press the screen and lift the phone to her ear, everything my parents thought was already finished was about to begin again. She did not raise her voice when the call connected, she did not sound emotional or uncertain, she sounded exactly like she always had when she made decisions that mattered, calm, precise, and completely in control. "This is Eleanor Carter," she said, her tone steady and unmistakable. "I need you to pull the Carter account records immediately." And I watched her face as she listened, a slight pause, a small nod, as if the person on the other end already understood the urgency without her having to explain it, and then she added, "Yes, the one assigned to my granddaughter, Emily Carter." And hearing my name spoken like that, clearly, officially, connected to something that was mine, made something tighten in my chest again. But this time it was not confusion, it was recognition, and she continued, "I want full documentation of the closure and transfer, including authorization signatures." And there was another pause, longer this time, and I could hear a faint voice through the phone, not the words, just the tone, respectful, attentive, and my grandmother's expression did not change, but her eyes sharpened slightly. "No," she said after a moment, still calm. "This is not a request, this is a directive." And that was when I realized something I had never fully understood before. She was not just reacting to what had happened, she was stepping into a position she had always held but rarely needed to use, authority that did not need to be loud to be absolute, and she listened again, then said, "Good, I will expect everything within the hour," and ended the call without hesitation, setting the phone back down beside her with a quiet finality that made the entire room feel different. And for a second neither of us spoke. I just stood there watching her, trying to process what I had just witnessed, because this was not the gentle version of my grandmother who told stories and held my hand. This was someone else entirely, someone who had built things, managed things, protected things long before I was old enough to notice, and she turned back to me, her expression softer again but still focused. "They think this is simple," she said. "They think it is already done." And I nodded slowly, because that was exactly how it had felt standing in that driveway, like everything had already been decided without me, like the outcome was final. And she shook her head slightly, not in disagreement with me but with the situation itself. "It is not done," she said, and there was something in her voice that made that sentence feel less like reassurance and more like fact, and she reached for my hand again, her grip steady despite everything. "Emily, when people move quickly, it is usually because they do not want to be questioned." And I thought about my parents, about how easily they had dismissed me, how quickly they had shut down the conversation, how confidently they had acted like there was nothing left to discuss, and for the first time I saw that confidence differently, not as strength but as something fragile, something that depended on no one pushing back. And she continued, "But once you ask the right questions in the right place with the right documentation, things have a way of changing." And I felt a quiet shift inside me again, the same kind of shift that had been building since the moment I saw that car. But now it felt clearer, more grounded, less like reaction and more like direction, and I realized this was no longer just about what had been taken. It was about what could still be proven. And she glanced once more at the phone, as if measuring time, as if already anticipating the next step before it arrived. And I followed her gaze, suddenly aware that whatever information was coming next would not just confirm what happened, it would expose how it happened, who was involved, and whether what they did could actually stand once it was seen clearly. And I did not realize then just how detailed that information would be, or how quickly it would begin to unravel the version of the story my parents believed they had secured. We did not have to wait long. Less than 40 minutes passed before her phone lit up again, the screen glowing softly in the dim room, and I saw the name displayed at the top, a full name, not saved casually but formally, the kind of contact you only kept when the relationship carried weight. And she answered immediately, placing the call on speaker without hesitation. "Yes," she said, her voice calm, and a man's voice came through, clear and professional, addressing her by name, confirming that he had the records in front of him. And as he began to speak, listing dates, account numbers, transaction times down to the minute, I felt my chest tighten with each detail. Because this was no longer abstract, this was not a suspicion or a feeling, this was a timeline, precise and undeniable, and he explained that the account assigned under my name had been accessed under a family authorization clause, processed 3 days after the last deposit, and fully transferred within a 24-hour window into a secondary account registered under my father's financial control, and I watched my grandmother's expression carefully as she listened, her face still composed, but her eyes focused in a way that told me she was tracking every word, every detail, and then the man continued, adding something that made the air in the room shift again. There is also a signed authorization form on file, he said, bearing your signature. And for a moment I thought I had misheard him, the words landing out of place, disconnected from everything I knew to be true. And I looked at my grandmother, waiting for her to react, to correct him, to say there must be a mistake, but she did not interrupt. She simply asked, dated when? And he gave the date, and it aligned exactly with the week she had been admitted to hospice, a time when she had barely left this room, a time when I had been sitting beside her almost every day, and something cold settled in my stomach as the realization formed slowly but clearly, and she asked one more question, her voice unchanged. And the signature has been verified. And there was a brief pause on the other end before the man answered carefully. It was processed as valid at the time, and that wording, processed as valid, felt different from confirmed, from authentic. It felt like something that had been accepted without being fully questioned, and my grandmother nodded once, even though he could not see her, and said, "Send me a copy of that document immediately," and he agreed, confirming it would be delivered electronically within minutes. And when the call ended, the room felt heavier, not chaotic, not emotional, just dense with understanding, and I stood there trying to process what I had just heard, the transfer, the authorization, the signature, and I said the first thing that came to mind, "You did not sign anything." And she looked at me, not offended, not surprised, just certain. "No," she said simply, and that single word carried more weight than anything else that had been said, because it meant the document existed, but it was not real, not in the way it was supposed to be. And she reached for her phone again, already opening her email, her movements steady, deliberate, and within seconds a notification appeared, and she tapped it, pulling up a scanned document on the screen, and she studied it carefully, her eyes moving across the lines, the signature at the bottom, the date, the formatting, and I watched her closely, waiting for some sign of hesitation, some moment where she might question herself, but there was none, only recognition, and then something else, something sharper, and she turned the phone slightly so I could see, and there it was, her name written in a way that looked almost right, almost convincing at a glance, but not quite, the curve of a letter off by just enough, the spacing slightly uneven, the kind of detail most people would overlook but she would not. And she let out a quiet breath, not shocked, not overwhelmed, but resolved, and she said something that made everything feel suddenly irreversible. "They did not just take it," she said. "They tried to make it look like I gave it away." And I felt a chill run through me, because that meant this was not just about money anymore, it was about intent, about planning, about a level of confidence that no one would look closely enough to challenge it. And she locked her phone, setting it down beside her once more. Her posture still calm, but her presence different now, more defined, and she looked at me and said, "This is where it changes." And I did not realize then how quickly that change would begin, or how unprepared my parents were for what was about to come next. She did not hesitate after that, not even for a second. She picked up her phone again, and this time her movements were even more deliberate, more precise, like each step had already been mapped out long before this moment arrived. And she dialed another number without looking at me, her focus entirely on what needed to happen next. And when the call connected, her tone shifted slightly, not softer but sharper, more formal. "I need you to come in first thing tomorrow," she said. "Bring everything related to the Carter estate, including the trust documents and any recent amendments." And there was a pause as the person on the other end responded, and she added, "Yes, this cannot wait," and ended the call just as quickly as the first. And I stood there trying to keep up with what was happening, because everything was moving faster now. No longer a quiet realization, but a sequence of actions that felt structured, controlled, intentional. And she turned to me again, her expression steady. "That was my attorney," she said, as if clarifying something that should have already been obvious, and I nodded slowly, because of course it was, of course she had someone, of course she had planned for more than just a conversation. And she adjusted slightly against the pillows, her posture still composed despite the setting, despite everything. "What they did," she continued, "relies on two things, speed and silence." And I felt that sentence settle into place immediately, because it explained everything: the quick transfer, the dismissive responses, the way they had acted like there was nothing left to question, and she went on, "They moved quickly so no one would look too closely, and they assumed you would stay quiet because you always have." And that last part did not feel like criticism, it felt like recognition, and I could not argue with it because it was true, it had always been true. But something about hearing it now in this moment did not make me feel small, it made me feel aware, and she reached for my hand again, her grip steady, grounding. "But this time is different," she said, and there was no hesitation in her voice, no uncertainty, just certainty, and I believed her, not because I wanted to, but because everything she had done in the last hour had already proven that she was not guessing. She was responding with knowledge, with preparation, with authority, and, she continued, "The document they used, that signature, it is not just wrong, it is traceable." And I frowned slightly, trying to understand what she meant, and she explained, "Every authorized transfer leaves a chain, who processed it, who approved it, when it was entered, where it was verified." And I felt a shift again, a realization that this was not just about proving the signature was not hers, it was about uncovering the entire process behind it, and she added, "Once that chain is examined, their version of this will not hold." And for the first time since all of this began, I felt something close to clarity, not relief, not yet, but direction, like there was a path forward that did not rely on arguing or convincing or hoping to be understood, but on facts that could not be dismissed. And she looked at me carefully, studying my expression, and asked quietly, "Are you ready for that?" And the question caught me off guard, not because I did not know the answer, but because I had never been asked it before, not like this, not in a way that assumed my choice mattered. And I took a breath, steadying myself, thinking about the driveway, the car, the way they had looked at me like I was irrelevant to something that belonged to me, and I nodded. "Yes," I said. And she held my gaze for a moment longer, as if confirming something, and then she gave a small nod of her own, like a decision had just been finalized. "Good," she said, and leaned back slightly, her eyes closing for just a second, not from exhaustion, but from completion, like the first phase of something had just ended and the next was already in motion. And as I stood there beside her, the quiet hum of the room around us, I realized that whatever came next would not happen in private conversations or quiet dismissals. It would happen in a place where everything had to be accounted for, where every action had a record, where every claim could be tested. And I did not realize then how quickly that confrontation would arrive, or how unprepared my parents would be when it did. The next morning did not feel like a normal morning. It felt like the beginning of something that had already been set in motion before I even woke up. And by the time I walked into the hospice room again, my grandmother was already awake, already dressed in a way that made the space around her feel less like a patient's room and more like a place where decisions were about to be made. And sitting beside her, exactly as she had said, was a man I had never seen before, mid-60s, silver hair, a leather briefcase resting neatly by his chair, and the moment I stepped inside, he stood up immediately, extending his hand toward me with a calm, measured professionalism that matched everything about him. "Emily Carter," he said, confirming my name before I even spoke. "I have heard a great deal about you." And there was something in the way he said it that felt different from how my family usually spoke about me. Not dismissive, not polite for the sake of appearance, but intentional, like my presence in this situation actually mattered. And I shook his hand, still trying to adjust to how quickly everything had shifted from quiet conversations to something that felt structured, formal, and real. And my grandmother gestured for me to sit, her expression steady, composed, the same controlled focus she had carried since the moment she made that first call. And the man opened his briefcase, laying out several documents across the small table. With careful precision, each page aligned, each detail visible, and he began speaking without wasting time, explaining that he had reviewed the account records, the transfer authorization, and the signature attached to it. And as he spoke, his tone remained calm, factual, but there was an undercurrent to it, something that suggested this was not routine, that what he was describing was not simply a financial adjustment. And he pointed to one of the pages, indicating the authorization form, the same one I had seen on my grandmother's phone, and he explained that while it had been processed as valid, there were inconsistencies, not obvious ones, not the kind that would be flagged immediately, but subtle differences in signature pressure, in timing, in the way the authorization was submitted relative to my grandmother's documented condition at the time. And I watched my grandmother as he spoke, her eyes steady, absorbing everything without interruption. And then he added something that made the entire situation feel even more precise. "We also have access to the internal approval chain," he said, "which identifies who reviewed and authorized the transaction at each stage. And that sentence seemed to shift the room again because it meant this was not just about a single document, it was about a sequence of actions, a process that could be traced step by step, and my grandmother nodded slightly, as if this confirmed exactly what she had expected. And he continued, explaining that once all documentation was formally compiled, there would be a clear basis to challenge the transfer, not as a misunderstanding, not as a family dispute, but as a procedural and legal issue. And I felt my breath steady slightly as I listened, because for the first time since this began, everything felt grounded in something solid, something that did not rely on who said what or who believed whom, but on records that could not simply be dismissed. And then my grandmother spoke, her voice calm but firm. "What is the next step?" And the man closed the folder gently, looking directly at her. "We request a formal review and initiate a reversal process," he said. "But before that, it would be advisable to notify all involved parties." And there it was, the moment I had been anticipating without fully understanding it, the moment where everything that had been done quietly would be brought into the open. And I felt a slight tension rise in my chest as I realized what that meant. My parents would know, Megan would know. There would be no more controlled conversations, no more quiet dismissals, and my grandmother did not hesitate. "Then we notify them," she said simply, and the clarity in her voice left no room for delay, no space for reconsideration. And as the attorney nodded, already reaching for his phone, I understood something with complete certainty. Whatever my parents believed they had secured, whatever version of the story they had constructed, it was about to be challenged in a way they could not ignore. And I did not realize then just how quickly that notification would reach them, or how their reaction would reveal more than they ever intended. The call went out before I even had time to fully process what was about to happen. The attorney stepped just outside the room for a moment, speaking in a low, controlled voice that carried the same precision as everything else he had done. And when he returned, there was a subtle shift in the atmosphere, not louder, not chaotic, just charged in a way that made it clear something had been set into motion that could not be undone. And my grandmother did not ask what was said, she simply nodded. Once, as if she already knew the message had been delivered exactly as intended. And for a brief moment the room fell quiet again, the kind of silence that comes right before a reaction. And it did not take long. Less than 20 minutes later my phone buzzed in my hand, the screen lighting up with my mother's name. And I stared at it for a second, not surprised, but still aware that everything was about to shift from controlled preparation to direct confrontation. And I answered, bringing the phone to my ear as I stepped slightly away from the bed, and before I could say anything, her voice came through sharp, not loud but tight, controlled in the way it always was when she was trying to maintain authority. "Emily, what is going on?" she said, and there was no greeting, no pretense, just the question, direct and immediate, and I could hear something underneath it, something unsettled, something that had not been there before, and I took a breath, keeping my voice steady. "I think you already know," I said, and there was a pause, brief but noticeable, and then she responded quickly. "We just received a call from an attorney claiming there is an issue with the account," she said, her tone shifting slightly, more defensive now. "This is unnecessary, Emily, you should have come to us first." And there it was again, the attempt to redirect, to reframe, to place the responsibility back on me as if I had created the problem by speaking up. And for a second I felt that familiar pull, that instinct to explain myself, to soften the situation, but it did not take hold this time, and I said simply, "I did come to you." And I let that sentence sit there, letting the truth of it speak for itself, and on the other end I could hear movement, the faint sound of my father's voice in the background, asking something I could not fully make out. And then my mother spoke again, her tone firmer now, more controlled. "This is being handled," she said. "There are details you do not understand." And I closed my eyes for just a second, because those words, that exact phrasing, had been used my entire life to close conversations, to end questions, to keep me in a position where I was expected to accept rather than challenge. And I opened my eyes again, looking across the room at my grandmother, who was watching me quietly, not intervening, not directing, just present, and I said, "I understand enough." And there was another pause, longer this time, and when my mother spoke again, the control in her voice had shifted slightly, not gone but strained. "Emily, do not escalate this," she said. "It will only complicate things for everyone." And that sentence landed differently than the others, because it was not dismissive, it was cautious, almost careful, and I realized in that moment that whatever the attorney had said, whatever information had been presented, it had already changed something on their end, something in how secure they felt about what they had done. And I felt that clarity again, that steady awareness that had been building since the moment I walked back into this room, and I said, "It is already escalated." And I did not raise my voice, I did not argue, I just stated it, because it was true. And on the other end the silence stretched longer this time. And then my father's voice came through, closer now, taking the phone. "Emily," he said, and there was something different in his tone, not the calm certainty he usually carried, but something tighter, more measured. "We can resolve this as a family." And I almost smiled at that, not because it was funny, but because of how familiar it was, how often that phrase had been used to keep everything contained, to keep everything controlled. And I looked at my grandmother again, at the quiet certainty in her posture, and I said, "Then you should not have taken it in the first place." And the silence that followed was complete, no immediate response, no quick correction, just a pause that felt heavier than anything that had been said so far. And in that moment I understood something clearly. Whatever they thought they had secured, whatever version of control they believed they still had, it was slipping, and I did not realize then just how quickly that loss of control would turn into something they could not manage at all. After the call ended, I stood there for a moment with the phone still in my hand, staring at the screen as it went dark, and I realized something had shifted in a way I could not undo, not because of what I said, but because of what I did not say. I did not explain, I did not soften it, I did not step back, and for the first time in my life, I let the silence do the work for me. And when I turned back toward the bed, my grandmother was still watching me, her expression calm but knowing, like she had been waiting for that exact moment. Not the argument, not the explanation, but the decision, and she gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, but enough to tell me I had crossed something, some invisible line I had spent years standing just behind. And I walked back to the chair beside her, sitting down slowly, my hands finally still after everything that had happened, and for a few seconds neither of us spoke, the quiet in the room no longer heavy but settled, like something had been put into place. And then she said, "They will try to control this." And I looked at her, already understanding what she meant without needing more explanation, because I had seen it my entire life, the way every situation was managed, reframed, redirected until it fit whatever version made them comfortable. And she continued, "They will call it a misunderstanding, they will say it was temporary, they will say they intended to explain later." And each sentence felt familiar, not new information, but confirmation of a pattern I had lived inside for years without fully naming. And I nodded slightly because I knew she was right. I had already heard the beginning of it on the phone, the careful language, the attempt to regain control of the narrative before it moved any further. And she shifted slightly against the pillows, her hand resting lightly over mine. "But they cannot control what has already been documented," she said, and that sentence landed differently than everything else, because it was not about emotion, not about fairness, it was about fact, something solid, something that did not change depending on who was speaking. And I felt that clarity again, stronger now, more stable, like I was finally standing on something that would not move beneath me. And she added, "And they cannot undo the chain once it has been reviewed." And I thought about what the attorney had said about the records, the approvals, the signatures, all of it connected in a way that could be followed step by step, and for the first time, I understood that this was not just about proving something wrong, it was about revealing everything that had been done to make it look right. And my grandmother's phone buzzed again softly on the table, another message, another update, and she did not rush to pick it up. She let it sit there for a second, like she already knew what it contained, and then she reached for it, unlocking the screen and reading quietly, her eyes moving across the text with the same focused calm she had shown all morning. And then she looked up at me and said something that made everything feel even more real. "They have scheduled the review." And I felt my breath catch slightly, not from fear, but from the realization of what that meant. This was no longer contained within calls and documents. It was moving into a space where everything would be examined, where every detail would matter, where there would be no room for vague explanations or quiet dismissals. And I asked, "When?" And she answered without hesitation, "Tomorrow." And that single word settled between us, clear and immediate, and I sat back slightly, processing it, how fast everything was moving, how quickly something that had been hidden was now being brought forward. And I thought about my parents, about how they must be reacting right now, the conversations happening in that house, the way they would be trying to piece together what they could still control and what they could not. And for the first time I did not feel like I was on the outside of that, trying to understand it. I felt like I was finally part of what was happening, part of the process, part of the outcome. And my grandmother squeezed my hand gently, bringing my attention back to her. "Tomorrow," she repeated softly, and there was something in her voice that made it clear this was not just another step. This was the moment everything would be brought into the open, and I did not realize Then just how much would come out once it did, or how impossible it would be for them to take it back once it was seen clearly. The next day did not feel like a confrontation. It felt like a reckoning, quiet but unavoidable, and the room where it took place was not dramatic or imposing, just a clean, neutral conference room with a long table, a few chairs, and documents already laid out in careful order. But the weight of what was about to happen sat in the air in a way that made everything feel sharper, more defined, and when I walked in beside my grandmother and her attorney, my parents were already there, my father standing near the table with his hands resting on the back of a chair, my mother seated with her posture straight and composed, and Megan off to the side, her arms crossed, her expression somewhere between defensive and dismissive, and for a brief second it felt like every other family moment I had ever been part of, the same positions, the same dynamic, but then the attorney stepped forward and that familiarity broke, because this was not a family discussion, this was something else entirely, and he began without delay, outlining the purpose of the review, his tone calm and professional. And as he spoke, I watched my parents closely, the way they held themselves, the way they listened, and I could see it clearly now, the difference from before. The certainty they had carried had shifted into something tighter, something more controlled, and when the authorization document was placed on the table, the same one I had seen on the phone, the same one with the signature that looked almost right but not quite, my father leaned forward slightly, his voice measured. "We have already explained this," he said, and my grandmother did not respond immediately. She simply let the attorney continue, and he pointed out the inconsistencies, the timing, the conditions under which the document was processed, the chain of approvals that followed, each detail presented clearly, without accusation, without emotion, just fact after fact, and I watched as those facts began to settle into the room, changing it, shifting it, making it harder and harder for anything else to stand against them. And my mother spoke next, her voice controlled but strained at the edges. "This is being taken out of context," she said. "There were discussions, there were decisions made as a family, and that word family landed differently now because it was no longer a shield, it was something being examined," and my grandmother finally spoke, her voice calm but unmistakably firm. "Then you will have no issue explaining why my signature appears on a document I did not sign." And the silence that followed was immediate, complete, and I felt it, the shift, the exact moment where everything they had been holding on to began to slip, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably, and my father opened his mouth as if to respond, but the words did not come as quickly as they had before, and for the first time I saw hesitation, real hesitation, not performance, not control, just the absence of an immediate answer, and the attorney stepped in again, continuing the process, outlining the steps required to reverse the transfer, to restore the account, to formally address the discrepancies, and each step felt like a piece falling into place, not chaotic, not uncertain, just structured and inevitable, and I stood there listening, watching, not interrupting, not needing to, because everything that needed to be said was already being said, not by me but by the documentation, by the process, by the truth that no longer needed to be defended. And I looked at my grandmother, sitting calmly beside me, her presence steady, unshaken, and I understood something then that I had not fully understood before. This was never just about the money, it was about something much deeper, something that had been building for years, something that could no longer be dismissed or redirected or quietly absorbed, and as the meeting continued, as the details unfolded and the outcome became clearer with each passing minute, I realized that what had started as a moment in a driveway, a single realization, had turned into something else entirely, something final, something that could not be undone. And as I stood there, no longer on the outside, no longer adjusting, no longer waiting to be acknowledged, I understood that this was the moment everything changed, not just for them but for me.